Hey everybody, in today's screencast we'll step away from the front lines of World War I to discuss an event that's not connected to combat operations of the war, but number one is related to the war itself, and number two is going to have major repercussions for those involved in the conflict. That event that we'll be looking at today is the Russian Revolution. So let's go to the essential questions. We'll see why Russia is really filled with problems during World War I. People are really unhappy with Tsarist rule in Russia during this time, and we'll see how that unhappiness is going to lead to the start of the Russian Revolution. Then we're going to meet kind of a key revolutionary group during this whole chain of events called the Bolsheviks. Who are the Bolsheviks, and who is their leader, and what role are they going to play in the Russian Revolution, and how will they eventually take control over the Russian government? And we'll finish up by seeing how all of this actually impacts World War I. What impact does the Russian Revolution and all the upheaval have for World War I and everybody involved in it? All right, so those are the essential questions. That's where we're headed today. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. During the 1800s and the early 1900s, the czars in Russia are really unpopular. The last really popular czar goes back to the early 1800s. That was Tsar Alexander, the guy who defeated Napoleon. But really, ever since then, people have been growing tired of czarist absolute rule. I mean, they've seen the world around them change to much more representative style governments. People have been just getting antsy and tired of living under this style of government. Economically, most people are very poor. Russia itself, really, even though it's industrialized, is behind other countries in Europe, and so people are just tired of czarist rule. It's been going on for a long time, and World War I is really the breaking point for everybody. Now, the Tsar, the emperor, the ruler of Russia during this time is Nicholas II. He's the fella at the top of the page there with a nice mustache and a chest covered in medals, and that's Nicholas and his family, along with his wife Alexandra and their wonderful children. The Tsar and his wife, really unpopular people, and again, World War I is just making all of this a whole lot worse. Russians are incredibly upset over the very incompetent way that the Tsar has directed the army and the war effort in World War I. I mean, to be perfectly honest, Tsar Nicholas is a pretty nice guy, okay? You can't really have too many complaints about him personally, but as far as a military leader goes, he's about as inept as the day is long and has just made bad decision after bad decision after bad decision in this war. The Russian army has suffered heavy losses. People have seen and heard and gotten the news about the losses of too many friends and sons and brothers and uncles and husbands, and morale at home is terribly low. And using what little resources Russia did have to supply the army was only making this a lot more unbearable to civilians. Remember, World War I is a different kind of war, and it's one in which the war effort is not just the responsibility of the soldiers, but also the civilians. The civilians are the ones that are making the war supplies in the factories, making the guns and weapons and the ammunition. But the civilians at home are also asked to sacrifice quite a bit, to eat less food, to use less heating oil, to use less metal, less coal, things like that, so that all those things can go to the war effort. And in Russia, where a lot of people are already very poor, having to give up more of these things only makes it worse. I mean, they suffer immensely. They're forced to live without a lot of basic comforts. Things like regular foodstuffs, heating oil, which in Russia is a big deal because it's really cold, so on and so forth, because all these things are needed for the military. So you have a whole lot of unhappy people, and World War I is just exacerbating the situation even more for the Russian population. Now, some of these people who were unhappy with Tsarist rule began to adopt the ideas of Karl Marx. You remember him, the founder of communism? And they started to join communist revolutionary groups that were seeking to topple the government. One of those groups was called the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks were led by their leader, a guy by the name of Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, better known to history by his alias Lenin, Vladimir Lenin. And Lenin's group, the Bolsheviks, was very radical. Remember that one of the key tenets of communism is the creation of revolution to topple the government, to instill that communist society. And Lenin's group wants to create revolution to topple the government, to get that society in place. They're responsible for, bank robberies, bombings, acts of terror, assassinations, generally a very violent group of radicals who want to create chaos, to create the revolution, to bring communism into play. They believe that they can do this, that they can create enough chaos to topple the government and then force this communist society on people because they really truly believe that you don't know what's good for you. They know what's best for you. And once they topple the government and force communism on you, you'll just realize how awesome it is and how right they were all along. So you've got all these revolutionary groups who are sort of sizing up the situation, and the most really kind of important of them here is going to be the Bolsheviks. They're not the biggest of the revolutionary groups, but they are going to be the most important. And by March of 1917, the situation is really reaching a boiling point. Food shortages, fuel shortages, all of this stuff is so bad. The furor against the war is so great that simply people have had enough, okay? Hundreds of thousands of workers simply stop working and go on strike on March 8th, 1917. They take to the streets of the city of St. Petersburg. They demand bread. They demand an end to the war. And then eventually their demands devolve into calling for the Tsar to step down from power. And these uprisings and gatherings and riots continue for about a week. And the Tsar attempts to call soldiers home from the front lines of World War I to try to put down the riots, but there's no soldiers available, so they're unable to come to his aid. And when he finally does get soldiers to arrive, these guys are reservists, they're raw recruits, and rather than dispersing the rioters, which is what they were brought there to do, they actually join with the rioters. And now you've created an even bigger problem. You have hundreds of thousands of people angry in the streets, calling for you to step down from power, and now they have guns. So the situation is not getting any better. The uprising is continuing unabated until the situation has gotten so bad that the Tsar really feels like he has little choice but to give in to their demands and agree to step down from power. On March 15th, 1917, 1 week after all this stuff began, Tsar Nicholas II, the last of the Romanov dynasty, signs the paperwork and agrees to abdicate, to step down from power, ending Tsarist rule in Russia, March 15th, 1917. And this is exactly what people wanted. And interestingly enough, this sort of like March revolution to topple the Tsar, it all happened without the influence of the Bolsheviks. That's because many of them are wanted criminals and were in hiding. And so as much as they thought they had to be the ones to create revolution to get rid of the government, they weren't needed. All of this happened without them. And now that the Tsar was gone, political power passed again, not to the Bolsheviks, but instead to a provisional government, a provisional or a temporary government. A provisional government is a government that will rule temporarily while you get ready to set up a new one. So when the old government falls, a provisional government rules on a temporary basis until you have new elections and get a new government set up. So a provisional government is now in control. However, the provisional government doesn't do themselves any favors because remember, the biggest thing that a lot of people were upset about was Russia's involvement in World War I. So it might have been wise to I don't know, think about pulling Russia out of the war, but the provisional government does not do that. They support continuing Russia's involvement in World War I. So while on the one hand, the provisional government was very popular at first because they represented a change and they represented, the change to a republic, they quickly shot themselves in the foot, so to speak, and plummeted their own popularity by keeping Russia in the war. The one thing that was already making everybody mad anyway, they decided to continue doing. So what had been very promising for the provisional government quickly turns south, and they become very, very, very unpopular. And with the weakness and unpopularity of the provisional government, the Bolsheviks really believed that now the time was right for their revolution. They weren't there to do the whole March uprising thing, but they think that the provisional government being as weak as it is, they could step in and topple that government easily. But there's a little bit of a problem. The Bolsheviks want to make their move, but they're kind of hamstrung because their leader, Vladimir Lenin, is currently in hiding in Switzerland. Remember, I told you a lot of these guys, because their group is very violent and radical and commits what are basically acts of terrorism, a lot of them are criminals, including Lenin. He's a wanted criminal, and he's in hiding in Switzerland at this time. So that makes kind of an uprising a little bit difficult. Well, the Bolsheviks are going to get some help from what would be considered a rather unlikely source, and that would be Germany. Remember, Germany's facing a major tactical issue in this war, and that's they're fighting a war on two fronts. They've got the French and the British in the west, and they have the Russians in the east. And Germany is desperate to stop fighting a two-front war, and they know Russia is the place that they can make that happen. They really want to get Russia out of the war so they don't have to do the two-front war or anything. And honestly, they feel like Lenin is the answer to that problem. Because the communists, the Bolsheviks, they want to get Russia out of the war. And what do the Germans want? They want Russia out of the war. So the Germans send some of their spies, some of their agents to Switzerland to hunt down Lenin. They find him and they offer him a deal. The deal is that the Germans will agree to smuggle Lenin back into Russia so he can make his revolution happen if Lenin agrees that once he takes power, he will pull Russia out of the war. Lenin agrees to the deal. The Germans sneak Lenin back into Russia on like a secret train car of a secret train that was headed in that direction. Lenin gets into Russia. He reunites with his Bolshevik brethren, and they begin campaigning and trying to drum up support for their cause in Russia. And once Lenin and the Bolsheviks think that they have enough strength and enough popularity on their side, they make their move. In November of 1917, the Bolsheviks stage a midnight coup d'etat and overthrow the provisional government, taking the seat of government and the source of power into their own hands. In the dead of night, they take over the government buildings, they take over roads, they take over military installations, and the Bolsheviks become the political power now in Russia, getting rid of that weak provisional government. And the very first thing that Lenin does with the Bolsheviks in power is make good on his deal with the Germans. With the Bolsheviks in power, Lenin immediately begins to negotiate a separate peace treaty with Germany, which is exactly what the Allies don't want, because as much as Germany wants the Russians out, because they don't want to fight a two-front war, the Allies want Russia to stay in the fight, because the Allies desperately need Russia to keep Germany busy on the Eastern Front. But that's not going to happen. In March of 1918, Lenin and his negotiators signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany. According to the treaty, Russia backs out of the war. They back out. That's not necessarily a surrender. They just agree to stop fighting. Russia is removed from the war, and as part of the treaty, Russia agrees to give up a huge amount of territory to Germany. If you look at the picture over there on the right, all of that land that's sort of in the orange and blue stripe space, that's all land that Russia gives up to Germany and Austria. It's unbelievable the amount of territory that they give up. One of the reasons it's so unbelievable is 1/4 of the entire Russian population lives in that area that they just gave up. A huge portion of Russia's entire industrial capacity and resource capacity is in that area that they just gave up. And so you're thinking, what on earth are these guys doing? Well, Lenin and the Bolsheviks, they think that they've pulled a fast one on everybody. Because, see, Karl Marx wrote in his book, Communist Manifesto, that once the communist revolution started in one place, that it was magically going to spread all over the world, and all the workers would rise up, and you'd have one big, gigantic, global communist community. And so Lenin and the Bolsheviks legitimately believe that they're going to get the last laugh, because they think, well, the communist revolution has started, so the joke's on you, Germany and Austria, because pretty soon everybody's going to be communist, and we're all going to be sharing that land anyway. And of course, that's a really stupid thing to think, because there's no way that was actually going to happen. But that really is what they thought was going to happen, and that's why they were willing to give up all that land, because they assumed communism would spread worldwide, and it would be going back into the hands of the communal society that is communism. Now, after this, the fight in Russia is not over, because even though the Bolsheviks are in charge, there are other factions that want to continue fighting, and Russia sort of collapses into this massive civil war that'll take place over the next several years. And one of the casualties of that civil war is the Romanov family, is the entire royal family. In 1918, Lenin himself personally ordered that the Romanov royal family be murdered, because he feared that they could be a standard around which the Bolsheviks' enemies might rally. And so this is just one chapter in a very brutal age that is the Russian Civil War. But the long and the short of this and how it all affects World War I is that Russia's revolution leads to Russia's withdrawal from World War I. That's kind of the big picture we're looking at as it connects to the war. And this is an immense blow to the Allies. However, at the same time that Russia is exiting the war, their exit is offset by the entrance of a new power, that being the United States of America. So that's where we're going to cut it off for today, guys. But we saw that World War I was the breaking point for Russia. It led to the fall of the Tsarist regime and ultimately the rise of the Bolsheviks and communism. And the big impact of all of this is that as a result of the Russian Revolution, Lenin and the Bolsheviks pull Russia out of World War I, adversely affecting everybody involved in this conflict. So those are the essential questions, guys. It's what we covered today. Be ready to discuss that stuff the next time that we meet. And as always, until that time, I bid you farewell.